the king is now the king, and he will act within the constraints, the constitutional constraints and precedent that are accorded by that place.
I think his secret ingredient is genuinely enjoying meeting everyone.
When I had to meet with His Majesty and I heard him speak about what matters to him, I was profoundly moved and thought I have to spend a chunk of my career helping that mission.
There'll be changes because, the fact of the matter is that he's his own man and he has strong views about what he thinks is the right way to go about things. So he won't be hidebound by the past.
When you have someone who's a very long-standing friend, you understand the many facets of his character. And he's a very, very multifaceted person. He has many extraordinary qualities.
Welcome to Being the King, a podcast about the role and character of King Charles III. My name's Simon Heffer, and I've been a columnist at the Telegraph for many years and have written extensively about the royal family. In this second episode, we're looking at the King's role as the United Kingdom's figurehead in the world, how he's our leading ambassador, and what good he can do for the country in its international relationships and in his role as head of the Commonwealth.
I do think he is probably the most effective ambassador that this country could possibly wish for.
Sir Stephen Lamport was Private Secretary to the King as Prince of Wales between 1993 and 2001.
Both as head of state, and that goes without saying, I think, but also in personal terms. He does have an extraordinary ability to relate to people of all kinds, of all creeds, in all countries, of all races. And I've seen him do that immensely effectively, in all parts of the world. He's very good at dealing with people. He has a way with people, which is very powerful. The state visit to Germany, I think, was a huge success.
In this regard, I did want to pay a particular tribute to Germany's extraordinary hospitality in hosting over 1 million Ukrainian refugees. This, it seems to me, so powerfully demonstrates the generosity of spirit of the German people.
I think it's useful to ask yourself, why was that? There are a number of reasons for that. Obviously, the fact of the matter is, what does the king represent? The king stands for something which is actually above politics, above party politics. So unlike a prime minister or unlike any government minister, he stands for something that actually is not related to a particular kind of set of policies which the government is trying to prosecute at that particular time. So he stands above that fray, and I think which is an important part of his special status. Secondly, because he's here for the long term. Now, obviously, it won't be 70 years. Of course it won't be. But, the fact of the matter is he's going to be here longer than prime ministers and governments. He's able to forge relationships personally with individuals, heads of state elsewhere, for example, which can be hugely valuable and which actually outlives and is stronger than the kind of links that you can often get from, let's say, a prime minister. He is the head of state, and therefore what he says has more sort of traction and impact than what others might say. Now, of course, all of those things are open, if you like, to abuse by a government. It's very important that governments don't try and use the head of state for reasons which are actually, less than representative of what he himself stands for. By which
one thinks of Her late Majesty being forced to entertain the Charles Cubes in 1978.
Yes, quite. We all know that was not a great visit, to say the least. What I'm really saying, I think, is this: that it's important that that when a head of state, when the king, in this instance, is overseas, he's there to be able to talk and express views in public, which are, in a sense, are a general reflection of the stance of Britain in the world. So the government has to use him in a way which reflects the kind of the stance of Britain without actually being seen to be an advocate for a particular...
Yes, which maintains his dignity as monarch.
And it erodes, again, the respect, which as head of state he would otherwise carry. I was very struck by the degree to which the Germans, went out of their way to celebrate him as head of state, addressing the Bundestag for the first time, the ceremony at the Brandenburg Gate. The fact is, he was able in what he said and what he did to sort of set a kind of tone of relationships between Britain and Germany of a kind which no other person could actually even begin to achieve. And I see him able to do that in all kinds of different contexts, in his overseas travels, in a way that governments should regard as being hugely important and a huge benefit. And of course, in doing that, you talk about repairing relations with Europe. I mean, he himself, by virtue of, I think, what he stands for in terms of integrity, in terms of his commitment to service and duty. I mean, he's, in a sense, his own personality stands for something which actually says a lot about Britain overseas, which I think is important to be able to say and to demonstrate. Only he can do that.
Camilla Tominey is an associate editor at the Telegraph and leading royal commentator. Can we just talk briefly about his role as an international figure and as the representative of our country abroad? He had this absolutely triumphant trip to Germany. Okay, he speaks German. Half of his family are German. So he had a head start. But, we've had tricky relations with the Germans and indeed with the French. Sadly, he couldn't go to France because of their problems. But since Brexit, things have been a bit sticky. And he showed a tremendous facility when he got there in putting them right and in making people like him and like our country. Do you see him as being a formidable asset for us in the years to come?
Internationally, he's an accomplished performer because he is so well-travelled and has absolutely taken a leaf out of his mother's book on that score. I think as well, the German reception, he had laid the ground for that because he had made previous, quite recent visits to Berlin where he had talked about the warmth of the relationship between the Germans and the British enduring post-Brexit. He's done a lot of speeches about post-Brexit relations and acutely understands the importance of keeping these European nations on side. There's talk now not just of a visit to Northern Ireland, but to the Republic of Ireland, because I think he wants to recreate the magic of his mother's trip in 2011. Speaking the language helps. There is a potency to him being the Queen's son. The respect that the French, for instance, had for La Reine, and Macron giving that really heartfelt speech after she died about how she was our queen in France. It's only natural that people will then turn out to see the next king and to see the Queen's son in that regard. And I think just as we've grown up with Charles being a very prominent fixture of royal life, so too have European royals. And let's face it, the British royal family are people's royal family. I know there are other royal families across Europe, but when people talk about the royals, they're talking about the British royals.
King and Queen's state visit to Germany was a triumph.
Lord Soames of Fletching was a Conservative MP from 1983 until 2019. He held several ministerial positions and has known the King since they were 12 years old. He is the grandson of Sir Winston Churchill.
I mean, all beautifully done, with all the tact and charm and experience that he has developed over the years. And of course, many of these people that he is visiting in each of these countries, he has known for a very long time. I know this will sound completely ridiculous, but I cannot think of any other institution which will be a finer advertisement for Great Britain than the King. I think he is the apogee of Britain's soft power.
I think he's absolutely fantastic at engaging with people across the board of all walks of life.
Victoria Ward, Telegraph Royal Editor.
Whether that's, as you say, presidents. I was on the recent state visit to Germany, and he clearly had a very good rapport with the German president, equally, and they were together for the whole 3 days in Berlin and Hamburg. Very jokey together, very natural, very at ease with each other. And similarly, when he's out meeting the crowds, he's fantastic. He's clearly interested in talking to people, what they have to say. He's always fascinated about why people are there to see him and quite self-deprecating. He's always keen to speak to people, to hear what they've got to say.
Do you think Germany was a rather special case? I mean, given that he is half German, effectively. And of course, I remember for decades, if you saw a glossy magazine or a German newspaper on a news vendor's stall in London, they always talked about Die Königin. They didn't talk about the English queen. She was just the queen. Is he en route to becoming Der König?
I thought, did you see he spoke in German?
I did.
Extensively, and it went down really, really well in the Bundestag.
Herr Bundespräsident, Deutschland und das Vereinigte Königreich haben ein großes Interesse an der Zukunft des jeweils anderen Landes.
2-minute standing ovation. And I think that quite symbolises what he's like in terms of he makes an effort, and that's very much appreciated in all the countries he goes to. He's not just there as a face who's just there to be seen and shake hands and leave again. He's genuinely keen to build relationships. He's interested in the culture, the people, the politics, the visits that he's making, the issues behind them. And you can see that clearly, that it's not just a front, that he genuinely cares, I think.
Hugo Vickers is an international authority on monarchy and aristocracy and is the author of Coronation, a book about the ceremony in 1953. What do you make of the king as a potential representative of his country as head of state? He's our senior diplomat, effectively. He does seem to have a knack, doesn't he, of going abroad and making a very good impression.
He does. I mean, the German state visit was very successful. He actually was already very popular in Germany. He's been many times, and of course he has many German relations, and he speaks quite good German too. And he has spoken in the German parliament before very effectively. So he's got quite a good following in Germany. I think that, as always, he will be a good representative to go out there. It won't be quite the same as the Queen, who, of course, over her long reign, she sort of accumulated a whole sort of portfolio of all the other places that she'd been to. The fact that she'd been to Japan and the fact that she'd been all around the Commonwealth and all these different things was a huge thing that she took with her everywhere she went. But I mean, I'm sure he'll do a good job. I mean, the Commonwealth is really important. I mean, the Queen fixed it that he should be head of the Commonwealth, and he does take that very seriously. I mean, we've seen already an example of that, because on the day of the Commonwealth observance, he spoke in the pulpit, and instead of, there's normally a reception at Marlborough House, he invited everybody back to Buckingham Palace, which was very popular and much enjoyed. So that's a good sign that he's taking it seriously. As well he must, because people are always wanting to join the Commonwealth, and it's a tremendous family of nations. It's something which it's been attacked by activists, and they call it a sort of post-colonial thing. It's not that at all. It's a voluntary group, and so I do hope that that works. The Queen, as I'm sure you know, never minded if they decided that they didn't want her to be the head of state anymore, as long as they stayed in the Commonwealth, and I'm sure that that will be his view too.
Sir Stephen Lamport, do you see him as being a very effective head of the Commonwealth? Australia is changing. Do you imagine that the King is not concerned that Australia might leave the Commonwealth, but that Australia might vote to become a republic? And if you think he is concerned, do you think that there's scope for something to be done about it at this stage?
Simon, two things I'd say. I mean, one is there's no doubting about his extremely deep-seated commitment to the Commonwealth. And the fact that he was voted in as the new head of the Commonwealth to replace his mama, says an awful lot about the understanding of that. And I think it's important that people do realise that that is a deep-seated part of his attitude to life. The Commonwealth to him matters greatly. The bigger question about members of the Commonwealth, becoming republics, so Australia, New Zealand, for example, I think it's important to understand or to bear in mind the difference between Commonwealth on the one hand and realms on the other. And the fact of the matter is that the King is head of state of Australia in this example. If Australia decides to become a republic, I mean, what is that saying? It's not saying anything about the King himself. It's expressing a national wish that that's where the country ought to go. And the King, and Prince of Wales as he then was always very clear that he has no difficulty with the fact that these are decisions which are for the people themselves to be able to make. It's not a comment about him. It's not a comment therefore about him as king. And I don't think there's any reason to suppose, for example, that if Australia becomes a republic, that is going to take away from Australia's commitment to the benefits and the importance of being a member of the Commonwealth, which does huge good. I think often unrecognisably huge good, in all kinds of ways, all kinds of levels, for its member states. So, although I think, I'm quite sure that when it were to happen, there would be a mixing up of both, the fact that it's a member of the Commonwealth and as a realm decided to go in a different way, that should not actually undermine his ability as the head of the Commonwealth.
There's growing rumours that Australia may try and have another referendum on the monarchies. Remember, the last one in 1999 was quite heavily defeated. They wanted to keep the Queen. Do you know whether the King would want to try and influence what the Australians do if a vote comes? If they did vote to reject the monarchy after 250 years nearly, do you feel that he would be comfortable with that, but perhaps comfortable with it provided they remained in the Commonwealth?
I think the King has made very clear that he believes that it is up to each one of these countries to settle their own destinies.
Nicholas Soames.
I think what might have been absolutely unthinkable under the Queen, the late Queen, becomes less unthinkable now because you can hear it all around you. You hear the chatter like I hear the chatter. Everyone hears the chatter. He has known these Commonwealth leaders for almost all of them for many, many years. He's been deeply involved in Commonwealth organisations and institutions since he was a very young man. And I think he understands very well the very different world in which we all live now. But obviously, I think for the world and for everyone else, the Commonwealth is a greatly undervalued and immensely important organisation.
Do you see him actively wanting to boost the standing of the Commonwealth? I mean, not least in the context that we are no longer in the European Union and that we have strong and historic links that perhaps we put on a back burner for 50 years while we were in the European Union. And now they may well become more significant to us again.
I think that's a very valid point. You know, there are colleagues of mine who you know well, who have for a very long time, people like Lord Howell of Guildford, David Howell, who have been saying this about the Commonwealth for years and years and years. And unfortunately, our revered Foreign Office paid very little attention to any of it and just sort of chased entirely after Europe. And I think we did neglect some of our old former allies and friends.
Hugo Vickers, do you think he is worried that Australia might get rid of the monarchy?
As I say, I don't think he'd be worried about it getting rid of the monarchy, but he would be worried if they left the Commonwealth. The two things are different. People never seem to, you understand that, but a lot of other people don't. But I think if they send him out there quite soon, or indeed send Prince William and Catherine and those cute children out there, I think you find every time they go there, they're immensely popular. I think they've got more important things to worry about than getting rid of the monarchy, quite honestly.
I sense, I may be wrong, but I sense that because of the relative unpopularity in this country of our politicians over the last 2 or 3 years, where we've had a very disrupted set of prime ministers, 2 of whom left office in not the best possible circumstances, that people looked, first of all, at Her late Majesty and now at the King, and think that, as Bagehot said, they both offered a sense of continuity and stability and impartiality and reliability that people look for in the leadership of a state or a nation. And to an extent, that is going to transfer abroad, isn't it? I covered the referendum in 1999 in Australia, and I remember people saying to me over there then that they thought their politicians then, they had a very good Prime Minister in John Howard at the time, were so below the salt and not up to necessarily international leadership, that to have a head of state who had the dignity of the late Queen was enormously valuable to them, and that's what they voted for.
Yes, and I think that the new king, if we should still refer to him in that way, is already showing himself to be a very splendid figure. I think he's sort of relaxed into the role. He's moved into it very well. If you try to compare him, say, to Edward VII, well, Edward VII was a rather profligate Prince of Wales. This Prince of Wales was a very dedicated one. But nevertheless, I suppose he always had his parents in the background, and now suddenly he's the top man. I think it shows. I think he's enjoying himself, and I think he's putting everything possible into it. And I think he's obviously totally on the side of Britain and the Commonwealth, which is great. I hope that they'll use him wisely. I didn't think that the Foreign Office used him very well in Barbados when they made him apologise for slavery as a stain on our character, because I think that opened up a lot of sort of things. Well, in that case, we're going to go for it, and it creates a lot of dissension, which I thought was a great pity.
He would only have done that on advice, though.
Exactly. I'm blaming the Foreign Office for making him do that.
I think he loves Australia, and I think he thinks that it's one of the jewels in the Commonwealth crown.
Camilla Tominey. But do you think there's a plan on his part, a strategy to try and stop it happening?
I think there's a plan to leave less unsaid. And that doesn't mean paying reparations or supporting the paying of reparations. But I think as they then were, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge's Caribbean tour, I think there's an agreement between father and son that they can't quite take the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh approach to things. The royal mantra is always, what did we do last time? Let's do it again. They tried to do what they did last time by putting William and Kate on the back of a Land Rover, and it just looked really weird, A, because they're not the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, and B, because it's the 21st century. So they're going to have to take a different approach, and I think sort of maintaining a dignified silence is not going to work with some of these communities that they don't want answers, they don't even perhaps want reparations, they just want to have the discussion. And I think Charles would probably share William's view on that. Something was written that they were going to abandon the Queen's never explain, never complain mantra. No, they're not saying that, but they're saying we want to leave less unsaid. So we've seen this creep into speeches by Charles when he's talked about Commonwealth issues. People do confuse the whole Commonwealth realm versus the Commonwealth itself. I mean, that Commonwealth as a body of nations is growing. There are people who are wanting to join it. It's taken on more potency in light of Chinese and Russian aggression in the Pacific and beyond. You know, it's not a bad thing to belong to. And I think he certainly wants to preserve that. Of course, he breathed a sigh of relief when he was chosen to succeed the Queen as the head of the Commonwealth. It's interesting, isn't it, these choices to go to these European countries ahead of some of the Commonwealth countries, but maybe they don't think it's quite urgent. Like all of us, you know, Australia's dealing with their own cost of living crisis and all the rest of it. The other thing that I think they think is, take Barbados. I mean, yeah, you could spin that and say, well, the people of Barbados have rejected the royal family. No, they haven't. Politically, Barbados decided to go republic, but they didn't put it to a public vote. I think his argument would probably be, quite rightly, well, ask the people. Because for as many protesters as you see on the television, there are also crowds of people cheering the royals' names. I've been on enough tours to know, of course there are protesters, but they are always outweighed by the people who are gathered to try and get that coveted handshake.
A lot of your fellow royal experts believe that the Prince and Princess of Wales will be deployed to go to Australia.
I remember going on the trip where they deployed Prince George as the Republican slayer, and it was very effective. Go out there, take the children. There's a massive Australian appetite for particularly the Princess of Wales. They love her out there. I do a lot of work for organisations like Channel 9 in Australia. They're obsessed with royal news. Get them out there, mobilise them. I mean, actually, the Princess of Wales is one of the most pivotal figures in this entire institution as the wife of a future king and the mother of a future king, and somebody who does add a huge amount of sort of stardust but also intrigue to the family. She's hugely important and playing a hugely important part. And I think the royals would be mad not to weaponise her in some of these countries that might be flirting with republicanism right now.
Nicholas Soames. His trip to Germany was interpreted as having healed some of the damage that the Germans felt had been done to our relationship after Brexit. We've also, it seems, got a slightly strained relationship with America, one of our closest allies. President Biden came here recently. He went to Northern Ireland for about half an hour, and they went on to the Republic, and he was interpreted as betraying certain anti-British feelings. Do you feel that the King will want to make it a priority to try and cement the historically very good relationship that we have with America?
Well, there's no doubt that the King understands entirely the absolutely primacy of our relationship with the United States of America. I agree with you that I personally, from my own point, speaking absolutely personally, I really thought that was perhaps a rather ungracious move of President Biden's. I don't think it's necessarily anti-British. I think it's just sort of, you know, how you deal with not wishing to be disrespectful, an old man who's got a long way to go. But I think it's a great pity that they didn't meet. But that, neither here nor there. The King, obviously, his job is to represent the interests of his country abroad, wherever he goes. And clearly, America, Europe, France, Germany, Italy are all very, very important to this country. But America, of course, has a slightly different, more meaningful relationship because of the defense and the security and all the other things that go with it, of which the King is very, very, very aware.
You've been listening to Being the King, a podcast by The Telegraph, with me, Simon Heffer. The producer is Isabel Boujard. with sound design by Elliot Lampitt. The executive producer is Louisa Wells, and the commissioning editor is Caroline Barrett-Haig. If you're not one already, may I suggest you consider becoming a Telegraph subscriber? Listeners to this podcast can get 1 month free, then 2 months for £1 by going to telegraph.co.uk/kingpodcast. In the next episode, we'll discuss the king and his people.